The summer of 1945 brought an impossible moment to Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. The 4th of July hung thick in the air, the kind of heat that made the smell of charred meat and melted butter linger like a ghost across the compound. 3 Japanese prisoners sat at a wooden table that stretched longer than any they'd seen in months. They'd arrived expecting horror. The stories passed between soldiers had painted America as a place of systematic cruelty, torture chambers, medical experiments on prisoners who couldn't fight back. Starvation had been promised. Instead, they'd been given mattresses, medical attention, and payment for their labor. Now this feast appeared before them, real food, untouched and steaming. Corporal Takashi Yamamoto picked up an ear of corn, its golden kernels glistening with salt and butter. The moment his teeth broke through the kernels, something inside him shattered. The taste arrived like a wave, sweet and smoky and impossibly rich. In that instant, Wisconsin vanished. He was standing at a summer festival in his village. The year was 1941. And his mother stood beside him at a grilling station, her face bright with the simple joy of a life before everything changed. His hands began to shake. Tears came without warning. Around him, 2 other prisoners were doing the same thing, grown men breaking down over a vegetable, not from hunger, but from the weight of everything they'd been told that turned out to be lies. The corn tasted like humanity itself, like being treated as something more than a weapon or a threat. 3 weeks earlier, the experience had been entirely different. The cattle car had stopped moving 3 minutes ago, but Takashi's heart still hadn't found its rhythm. Through the wooden slats, impossibly tall pines stretched toward a sky he didn't recognize. Nothing resembled the island palms of Okinawa. The air itself felt different, clean and cold, even though it was summer, and underneath that foreign coolness, something else drifted on the wind. Smoke, meat cooking. Sweet smoke that belonged to a world he thought had ended in fire and chaos. His fingers moved without thinking, finding the small hard object sewn into the hem of his uniform jacket. The cyanide capsule had been with him for weeks, ever since the cave. He should have used it before capture. The commanders had made that clear. Soldiers didn't surrender. They died with honor. But the American flamethrower had come too quickly, the cave filling with orange light and heat, hands grabbing him, dragging him into daylight before he'd had a moment to choose his own ending. For 3 weeks aboard the transport ship, the capsule had felt like possibility, like control, like proof that he could still choose something in a world where everything else had been decided for him. The cattle car doors screeched open, sunlight poured in, and Takashi squinted against the brightness. American soldiers stood framed in the opening, but the one closest to the door wasn't holding a rifle. He held a clipboard and wore the expression of a man moving furniture, not prisoners of war. "Come on, move it," he said, waving them forward with the tone of someone doing a job, nothing more. Takashi's boots touched American soil. Enemy territory. He looked around, searching for the thing he'd been promised by every officer who'd ever briefed him. The torture compound. The revenge. The payback that Americans would extract for every death on those Pacific islands. Instead, he saw more guards standing casually, wooden buildings arranged in neat rows, a flagpole with the American flag snapping in a wind that felt too peaceful, and beyond that, something that made no sense at all. Men playing baseball, their laughter carrying across the compound like it was a normal summer day, somewhere normal. "Name?" the clipboard soldier asked. Takashi opened his mouth but found his Japanese had locked somewhere deep in his throat. His English consisted of 4 words, barely that. Yes. No. Water. Help. A different soldier approached, and Takashi recognized immediately that this one was different. The face was Japanese, but the uniform was unmistakably American. The man's expression stayed carefully blank as he spoke in perfect Tokyo Japanese, the kind that belonged to someone who'd grown up speaking it as a first language. Your name, rank, and unit. They need it for processing. Yamamoto Takashi, Corporal, 60th Infantry Division. His voice came out rough, unused. The translator wrote something on a form, then gestured toward one of the wooden buildings. Medical examination. Everyone gets checked. Move. The medical building smelled like something Takashi didn't have a name for, antiseptic, something clean and sharp. He was directed to a chair where an American doctor with grey hair and glasses began examining him without speaking a word. The man's hands were surprisingly gentle as they touched the coral wound on Takashi's left forearm. The infection that had been festering and spreading since Okinawa. The wound had become part of him. A constant pain that he'd stopped noticing the way you stop noticing the weight of your own body. The doctor's touch should have felt like violation, like an invasion of something that belonged only to him. Instead, it felt like mercy. For months, no one had touched his injuries with anything except violence or indifference. The doctor said something to a nurse who disappeared and returned with a syringe. Takashi's entire body went rigid. This was the moment. The injection, the experiment, the thing they did to prisoners in American camps. The translator appeared suddenly at his elbow. Penicillin for the infection. It'll hurt for a moment, then you'll start healing. The needle went in. Takashi waited for poison, for fire spreading through his veins. Instead, there was only a dull ache that faded quickly. The doctor wrapped his arm in clean bandages, made a note on a chart, and waved him out. Outside, Takashi found himself with other new arrivals. Men whose uniforms hung loose on frames that had survived what shouldn't have been survivable. 2 faces registered immediately. A boy who couldn't have been more than 19, with Navy insignia still visible on his torn uniform, and an older man in his mid-30s maybe, wearing sergeant stripes and carrying eyes that had absorbed too much. Nakamura Hiroshi, the boy whispered, introducing himself the way one might confess to a crime. Pulled out of the water at Lady Gulf when our destroyer went down. I thought I was drowning. Then I thought Americans would shoot me in the water. They pulled me out instead and gave me a blanket. Kenji, the older sergeant said, his voice flat and practiced. Saipan, I watched civilians jump off cliffs rather than surrender to us. Got hit by artillery afterward, woke up in an American field hospital. He paused. I should be dead. We all should be dead. They were marched to a barracks, a wooden structure with rows of actual beds. Not mats on the floor, not dirt. Each bed had a thin mattress, a pillow, a folded blanket waiting. Takashi sat on the edge of his assigned bed and stared at his own hands like they belonged to a stranger. This had to be temporary. A trick to make them compliant before the real cruelty began. That's what they'd been told. American camps softened prisoners first with comfort, then applied the real punishment. Make you weak. Make you dependent on their mercy, then take it away. But then the dinner bell rang. They were herded to a mess hall, and Takashi stopped in the doorway. The room was crowded with prisoners, maybe 200 men sitting at long tables eating from metal trays. The smell hit him like a physical force. Rice, vegetables, and meat. Actual meat. A guard pointed them toward the serving line. Takashi moved as if underwater. A man in an apron, recognizable as a prisoner by his German uniform, dumped food onto his tray. Rice, green beans, a piece of pork, bread, an apple, more food than he'd consumed in a single day in 6 months. He carried his tray to where Nakamura and Kenji had already settled at a bench. The 3 of them stared at their meals. Around them, other prisoners ate normally. Some talked quietly. Some looked as stunned as Takashi felt. It's poisoned, he whispered. It has to be. Kenji was already eating, slowly and methodically, like a man who'd made peace with whatever came next. If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead. This is something else. I don't know what, but it's not poison. Takashi picked up his fork. The rice was warm and sticky and real. One bite, then another. His body didn't know what to do with the sudden influx of actual nutrition. His stomach cramped, then settled. Nakamura ate like the food might evaporate if he didn't consume it immediately. Between bites, he spoke. My brother told me Americans eat their prisoners, that they're cannibals, but we got this. He gestured at his tray. Nothing makes sense. That night, lying in the darkness of the barracks with 50 other men who shouldn't have been alive, Takashi found the capsule in his hem again. He rolled it between his fingers, feeling its hardness, its promise. A way out, but escape from what exactly? Kenji's voice came from the next bed, quiet in the darkness. I served in China from 1937 to 1941. Saw things. did things. A long pause stretched between them. I don't understand mercy anymore. Not really, but whatever this is, I don't think it's a trick. I think it's something worse. What could be worse than torture? Nakamura asked from somewhere in the shadows. Being treated like a human being, Kenji said quietly, when you've spent 4 years learning how to be a weapon. Takashi closed his eyes. Outside, somewhere in the Wisconsin night, that smell drifted past again. Meat cooking, sweet smoke rising into darkness, the impossible scent of peace in the middle of war. 4 days into his time at Camp McCoy, routine had begun establishing itself like something inevitable. Wake before dawn, breakfast, more food than seemed possible. Then work assignments. Takashi had been placed on agricultural detail with Nakamura and Kenji, though he couldn't determine if this represented mercy or some larger strategy. The work truck bounced over rutted roads, carrying 16 prisoners toward the camp farm. Wisconsin's summer heat was different from the Pacific. Drier. The humidity that had clung to skin like wet cloth back home had vanished, but the sun still beat down relentlessly as they climbed from the truck and faced seemingly endless rows of corn already shoulder-high and continuing to reach upward. Beyond that stretched beans, tomatoes staked and sprawling across the ground, cabbage and lettuce. An American guard named Sergeant Miller stood waiting with Private Tanaka, the Japanese-American translator. Miller was older, maybe late 30s, with a face that revealed years in uniform. He removed his helmet when he addressed them, a small gesture that Takashi noted despite himself. "You'll be weeding the bean rows today," Tanaka translated, his voice carefully neutral. "We're behind on the harvest schedule. You work until 1100 hours, break for lunch, continue until 1500. You'll be paid 80 cents per day. Camp credit, cigarettes, candy, writing paper, whatever the canteen has in stock." The concept of payment still didn't make sense. Takashi waited for the catch, the hidden punishment, but Miller simply gestured toward the field and walked away to supervise another group. They worked in silence at first, pulling weeds from between bean plants. The physical labor felt good after weeks of confinement, first in the ship's depths during transport, then the initial processing days. Takashi's muscles ached, but it was the clean ache of exertion, not the festering pain of untreated wounds. Around mid-morning, a whistle sounded. Water break. They gathered in the shade of an equipment shed where large metal containers waited. Takashi drank deeply, the water cold and clean, without rust or disease. He was learning not to question small mercies, simply to accept them. That's when the German approached. The man was young, maybe 20 at most, with sun-bleached hair and a wide smile that seemed absurd, given their circumstances. He wore the same prisoner uniform, but carried himself with an ease that suggested comfort in this place. He walked up to their group, holding out a chocolate bar. "Klaus," he said, pointing to himself, then speaking rapid German that meant nothing to Takashi. Nakamura's eyes widened at the sight of chocolate. Real chocolate. Not the chalky rations from the Imperial Army, but actual Hershey's chocolate with English letters on the wrapper. Takashi shook his head sharply. This was a test. It had to be. Accepting gifts from other prisoners showed weakness. He'd be reported. For what exactly he didn't know, which made it worse. Klaus laughed and broke off a piece, eating it himself. Then he pulled out a battered photograph showing a woman with kind eyes and 2 smaller children. He pointed to them, then to himself. "Mother. Hamburg." Kenji stepped forward slowly. He took the offered chocolate, nodded his thanks, and examined the photograph carefully. Then he pulled out his own, creased and water-stained, showing a woman and a teenage girl. "My family, Tokyo." Klaus's face lit up with recognition, not of the city itself, but of something universal. The language of longing. Of men far from home, showing each other proof that they'd once possessed lives beyond war. Through gestures and broken English, Klaus communicated something that shook Takashi more than any interrogation could have. The Germans had been here longer, months, some of them. Klaus pointed to the fields, to the barracks, to his own body, visibly healthier than it should have been. He mimicked eating, sleeping, working. Then he held up his fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 months of this treatment. Not a trick. Not temporary. Policy. Americans are fair. Klaus said carefully in English, then shrugged as if the word was inadequate but the best he possessed. He pulled out another photograph, and his expression turned wistful, holding something in his hands that spoke louder than any words could have. The photograph sat in Klaus's weathered hands, rubble scattered across what had once been streets, buildings reduced to twisted metal and ash, his entire world flattened into concrete and devastation. He pointed at it, then made an explosion gesture, his hands moving outward in a sharp, deliberate arc. Hamburg bombs, finished. The message required no translation. The same nation that had obliterated his city now handed him chocolate, gave him meals, paid him wages for the work he did on the farm. Klaus's expression held more bewilderment than gratitude, as though he too was wrestling with the impossible contradiction and losing. When he returned to his group, Nakamura leaned close and whispered words that Watanabe completed. If Germans have been treated this way for months, then this isn't special. It's simply how Americans do things, not a deception reserved just for us. Takashi wanted to push back, to argue that this had to be American propaganda, a calculated effort to soften them before something worse arrived. But the mounting evidence kept dismantling his resistance. During the midday meal, they sat beneath the shade of a broad oak, while guards distributed sandwiches, genuine sandwiches with meat between bread. Private Tanaka, the translator, positioned himself nearby. Not exactly with them, but close enough that words could pass between them. For several long minutes, silence held the space. Then Nakamura, youngest and most daring, broke through it. "Where are you from?" Tanaka's jaw tightened visibly. "California, Sacramento. My family ran a strawberry farm." Had Watanabe caught the past tense hanging in the air. "We were removed in 42, locked up at Manzanar." Tanaka's voice remained flat, but something fierce burned beneath the surface. "American citizens, every one of us. My parents, my grandparents, all born in California. None of it mattered. Wrong faces meant everything got taken. They put us behind barbed wire." The words lingered between them like ghosts. Something shifted inside Takashi's understanding. A Japanese man wearing an American uniform sat before him. A man his own country had imprisoned, now serving as interpreter for actual enemy soldiers who received better treatment than his own family had known. "Why do you wear that uniform?" Takashi asked quietly. Tanaka held his gaze for a long moment before answering. "Because it's my country, even when my country forgot that." He paused, then continued. "You know what's strange? The food at Manzanar and the food here at McCoy. Almost identical. Hot dogs, rice, canned vegetables. America treats everyone the same when it comes to basics. Even when it's contradictory, even when it's deeply hypocritical, there's still a baseline, a flaw that doesn't get crossed." He stood, brushing crumbs from his uniform. "I'm not claiming America is perfect. I'm saying that even imperfect principles beat having no principles at all." That afternoon, while working among the corn rows, Takashi couldn't stop his mind from returning to the conversation, to Tanaka's careful anger, to a simple accumulating fact. For 4 consecutive days, he'd received 3 substantial meals daily. His wounds had been treated, he'd earned payment for his labor, and violence had never touched him once. When the whistle sounded at 1500 hours, marking the workday's end, Sergeant Miller walked toward their group. He spoke to Tanaka, who translated. "The sergeant says, you've done solid work today. Tomorrow you'll help with the corn. It's growing fast, needs constant attention." Tanaka paused, then added something Miller hadn't said. He also mentioned his wife needs daikon radish for a Japanese recipe. He's wondering if any of you know how to grow it. Takashi looked up sharply. An American soldier asking captured enemy prisoners about Japanese vegetables. The absurdity struck him like a physical thing, the domestic ordinariness of it cracking something small but critical inside his chest. "I know daikon," he said quietly. "My mother grew it before the war." Miller's face broke into a smile when Tanaka translated. He nodded and offered something else. "He says if you want, you can plant a small patch behind the barracks. There's room. Consider it a garden project." That night, lying in his bed, Takashi's hand didn't reach for the cyanide capsule. Instead, he stared upward into darkness and thought about daikon seeds. about his mother's garden, about the bewildering possibility that he might grow something here and watch it emerge. By early July, Camp McCoy had established a rhythm Takashi could no longer deny. Days followed a pattern that had become almost ordinary in its consistency. A bell sounded at dawn, not shouting. Breakfast arrived in the mess hall with portions that never diminished. Work details took them into fields where corn had grown taller than men, stalks thick and robust, leaves rustling beneath the Wisconsin wind. Lunch came next, then more work, dinner, and evenings free to write letters, play cards, or simply sit as light faded and try to remember who they'd been before everything changed. Behind the barracks, the small Japanese garden was establishing itself. Takashi checked it each evening, watching daikon radishes push through the soil. He'd planted them with seeds Sergeant Miller had somehow obtained, traded from another camp, maybe, or ordered from a seed catalogue. Those green tops emerging from American earth transformed something in Takashi's carefully maintained worldview. You couldn't plant things if you anticipated death. Gardens were declarations of faith in a future. On July 3rd, the camp commandant made an announcement. Prisoners gathered in the central yard, while American guards stood at relaxed attention, and Private Tanaka translated. The commandant, a tall man with grey threading through his temples, spoke slowly to ensure understanding. Tomorrow is Independence Day, Tanaka's voice carried across the assembly. America's birthday, 169 years of independence. There will be a celebration. A cookout for all prisoners. The corn you've been cultivating will be grilled fresh. There will be beef. Music. You're invited to participate. Invited, not commanded, not compelled. Invited. Takashi felt Nakamura shift beside him. The boy's face showed naked excitement before he could suppress it. Fresh grilled vegetables. Beef. Nakamura had been 15 when he'd enlisted in the Navy, and even then, meat had been a rare privilege in wartime Japan. The promise of it now, offered from enemy hands, created visible conflict across his young features. It's propaganda, to Takashi whispered. Photos for American newspapers showing how well enemy prisoners are treated. It's strategy. But Watanabe, standing on his other side, said nothing. The old sergeant had grown quieter over recent weeks, increasingly withdrawn. He worked hard in the fields, ate his meals in silence, and spent evenings staring into nothing. Takashi had found him once, tears streaming silently down his face after lights out. When pressed, Watanabe had only answered, "I'm remembering things I wanted to forget." It's harder than forgetting ever was. That evening inside the barracks, the atmosphere grew strange and fractured. Some men were genuinely excited, the younger ones mostly, like Nakamura, who couldn't hide their hunger for celebration, for normalcy, for anything resembling life instead of mere survival. Others remained suspicious, defensive, convinced this was an elaborate humiliation designed to spring its trap. And then there were men like Takashi, suspended between worlds, unable to reconcile their actual treatment with everything they'd been taught to believe. The tension escalated when new prisoners arrived just after dinner. The truck pulled up, discharging 15 men who appeared pulled directly from combat. Their uniforms hung in tatters, faces gaunt and hollowed, and they moved with the jerky wariness of soldiers expecting violence at any moment. Among them stood an officer, Lieutenant Sasaki. Even battered and captured, he carried himself with rigid military formality. His eyes swept across the camp, the clean barracks, the well-nourished prisoners, the guard offering water with a gesture that wasn't friendly but wasn't hostile, and his face twisted with something resembling disgust. That night, Sasaki held court in the barracks, his voice carrying an authority that made men listen despite themselves. "This is shame," he said, his Tokyo accent sharp and precise. "This comfort, this acceptance. You've forgotten yourselves, forgotten the emperor, forgotten Bushido. When I was captured 3 days ago, I tried to die. I wanted to die, but they pulled me from the rubble and put me on an aircraft like cargo, not an enemy. And now I see this. Men playing softball, eating American food, planting gardens. You've gone soft. You've become collaborators." Takashi felt the words like stones settling in his chest. All the doubt he'd been pushing down surged back up. Had they betrayed something fundamental? Was survival itself a form of treason? Nakamura lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling. After Sasaki's tirade finally ended and lights went out, he whispered, "My mother sent a letter. It came today. She's alive in Tokyo, but barely. Food is scarce. She's eating twice daily if she's fortunate. She wrote that she's proud I'm alive, but I should remember my honor." What does honor mean anymore? Watanabe's voice came from the darkness. "I've been thinking about China, 37 and 38. The villages my unit passed through, the orders we followed. I remember a farmer who offered us vegetables from his field. Melons. He was trying to be kind. My commander shot him anyway, said we couldn't trust Chinese generosity. Had to be a trap." He paused, and Takashi heard him breathing in the darkness. "And now here I am, eating American food, receiving more mercy than I ever showed anyone. What's the word for that? It's not honor, it's not justice. It's something else. I don't know what it is." Takashi felt the cyanide capsule through his jacket, hung on the post beside his bed. He could end this confusion, stop the cognitive torment of being treated humanely by people he'd been taught to see as demons. It would be simple, honorable even by the code he'd been raised with. But then he thought of the daikon garden, seedlings pushing through soil, of Sergeant Miller casually asking about Japanese vegetables, of Clues the German showing photographs of his destroyed city while eating chocolate provided by the same people who'd demolished it. The 4th of July dawned clear and hot. The camp farm had been transformed overnight. Long wooden tables stretched in organized rows, American flags flying without being forced into prisoner spaces. They marked American areas, a declaration rather than an imposition. Grills stood ready, already smoking, sending up the scent of cooking meat and something else, something sweet and charred and full of promise. Takashi walked toward the celebration with Nakamura and Watanabe flanking him. Other prisoners streamed from the barracks, some eager, some reluctant. Lieutenant Sasaki remained inside, visible through the window, sitting rigidly on his bunk in protest. A small band played, American prisoners from another compound apparently, musicians given instruments. The music was strange, brassy and upbeat, nothing like military marches or traditional songs Takashi knew, but it carried a rhythm that made even reluctant feet tap. The serving line formed naturally, guards and prisoners mixing in ways that would have been unthinkable months ago. Takashi picked up a metal tray and moved forward, watching as American soldiers served food onto it. Grilled beef still sizzling in a sweet sauce, beans, potato salad, bread with butter. And then at the line's end, the corn. 2 ears per person, still partially husked, the silk brown and crispy where flames had kissed it. Butter pooled between the kernels, salt crystals visible like tiny stars. He carried his tray to where Nakamura and Watanabe had already sat. Around them, celebration noise swelled. Laughter, conversation in a dozen languages, the clink of utensils on metal trays. Clues the German walked past, waved, called out something cheerful in his language. Takashi stared at the corn on his plate. Steam rose from it, carrying that smell, that impossible memory-laden smell. He lifted the corn first. Heat radiated through the husk, warming his palms. He could see the kernels beneath the charred silk, golden and plump, glistening with butter pooled in the grooves. A single salt crystal caught July sunlight like a diamond. He brought it to his mouth and bit down. Taste exploded across his tongue, sweet, smoky, butter, rich and creamy, char adding depth, salt brightening everything. But it wasn't just flavor. It was August 1941. It was his village. It was the summer festival before conscription, before war, before everything turned dark. His mother at the grill, laughing as she turned corn over coals. His sister begging for the first ear, always impatient. Night air full of lanterns and music, and the certainty that the world would always remain this way. Takashi's hands began shaking. The corn trembled in his grip, juice running down his wrist. He tried to take another bite, but his throat had closed. The tears came before he could stop them. Hot, unstoppable, 4 years of accumulated grief pouring out over a piece of grilled corn. He wasn't crying because the corn was good. He was crying because he'd forgotten. Forgotten that food could taste like home, forgotten that the world had once held summer festivals and mothers and sisters laughing, forgotten that he'd ever been anything other than a soldier, a weapon, a man preparing to die. The corn tasted like being human, and that was unbearable. Beside him, Nakamura had frozen with his own corn halfway to his mouth. He was watching Takashi, and something in the older man's breakdown gave him permission. When Nakamura bit into his corn, his face crumpled immediately. He was 19. He'd enlisted at 15. He'd watched both his brothers die in the Philippines, letters arriving weeks apart, each one destroying their mother a little more. He'd been pulled from the water at Leyte Gulf after his destroyer exploded, certain he would drown, certain he deserved to drown for surviving, when so many hadn't. They died believing lies, Nakamura whispered, corn still in his hand. Both of them, they never surrendered because they believed what we were told. His voice broke, and here I am, alive, eating food better than anything the Navy ever gave us. They should be here, not me. They should. He couldn't finish. He set the corn down and buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking. Watanabe ate slowly, methodically, the way he did everything. But tears tracked down his weathered face, silent and steady. He was thinking about China, about villages his unit had passed through in 37 and 38, about the farmer who'd offered melons from his field, a gesture of hospitality, maybe fear, maybe just human recognition, about his commander shooting the man anyway because kindness had to be a trap, because you couldn't trust the enemy, because mercy was weakness. He thought about the old woman in another village who'd given them water. Grandmother aged, she'd bowed and offered the ladle with trembling hands. They'd taken the water first, then torched her house as they left. Orders from above. Can't leave supplies behind for the enemy to use. Can't show weakness. Every bite of corn tasted like the meals he'd stolen, like every act of kindness he'd turned away or destroyed. Every single time he'd decided to be a soldier instead of a man. And now he sat here, accepting mercy he'd never given to anyone, eating food made by people whose brothers and sons his own country had killed. The cruelty of it all broke something inside him. I don't deserve this, Takashi said, his voice barely audible. Not any of it. The food, the medicine, the garden. Cloud showing me his family pictures like we're just regular men. I should be, he paused, throat tight. I did things in China. I followed orders, and I did things. And now they're acting like I'm worth saving. The meal went on around them. Some prisoners ate with genuine joy, younger men drafted into service but never truly convinced by the ideology, who could accept kindness without wrestling with it. Others sat silent, processing their own inner conflicts. Cloud, the German, was laughing with a fellow prisoner, both struggling to speak through broken English and wild hand gestures. Sergeant Miller moved between the tables, not watching over them like a guard, but present. His whole face relaxed in a way that showed he genuinely enjoyed feeding people, even men who'd been enemies just months before. Private Tanaka stood apart from the crowd, arms folded across his chest, observing everything. His expression was difficult to read, satisfaction mixed with resentment and something else, something gentler underneath. When Takashi noticed him looking back, he came over. My family never got a 4th of July celebration at Manzanar, Tanaka said quietly in Japanese. We got hot dogs and some bean salad, but there wasn't any celebrating. Just another Tuesday, he said after a moment. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I'm trying to tell you something important. America is full of contradictions, hypocritical all the way through. They locked my family away behind barbed wire just for having Japanese faces, yet here they are treating you, actual enemy combatants, by the Geneva Convention. It's maddening. But listen. He gestured toward the gathering where guards and prisoners sat together. Even flawed principles beat having none at all. Even mercy that's applied unevenly beats calculated, systematic cruelty. You follow me? Takashi rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. I don't know what I understand anymore. That's where it starts, Tanaka said. Then came shouting at the gate, feet pounding, voices urgent and strained. The music stopped dead. Sergeant Miller immediately strode toward the noise, other guards following close behind. Prisoners looked up from their plates, and suddenly tension came rushing back into bodies that had only just started to relax. Takashi's hand went automatically to where his cyanide capsule would hang if he'd still had his uniform jacket on. Fragments of information started flying through the compound, whispers in different languages as each person passed along what they'd picked up. Bomb. Japan, a city destroyed. Private Tanaka had turned completely white. He was listening to a radio someone had brought outside, his jaw getting tighter with each word he heard. When he finally faced the gathered prisoners, his voice wavered. They're saying Hiroshima, some new kind of bomb, one bomb, and the whole city. He stopped, searching for the right words in Japanese. They're saying tens of thousands are dead, possibly far more, from a single bomb. The celebration didn't fade gradually, it simply vanished, like someone had cut every thread holding it up. Food went down on plates. The corn on Takashi's dish, half finished, suddenly felt wrong. How could he sit here crying over corn when his country was burning? My cousin lives in Hiroshima. Someone's voice came from the back of the group, and that voice broke something open. I don't know if he's alive. Takashi stood up suddenly. The table lurched and his tray clattered to the ground, metal on wood. Corn scattered across the wooden boards, a trail of melting butter left behind. He just stared at it, that beautiful golden corn that had felt like humanity, like home. And now it just looked like refuse, like waste, all of it wasted. The kindness, the gardens, the carefully maintained rhythm of days. What good was any of it when whole cities could simply vanish in an instant? What's more, picked up the fallen corn, held it a moment, then set it carefully back on the table. We're still at war, he said. His voice sounded hollow. We forgot. For 3 weeks we actually forgot. But the war didn't forget about us. Nakamura had become very still, the way frightened young soldiers do when they're trying not to fall apart. His lips moved without sound, and Takashi realized he was counting. Counting something, maybe days or maybe heartbeats, or all the different ways the world could end while you were eating corn at a table on a summer afternoon. The guards clustered around radios now. American prisoners from other sections of the camp had come over too, everyone desperate to hear the broadcasts, to grasp what this meant. With all the confusion, no one was really watching the Japanese prisoners. No one stopped them when they gradually drifted back toward their barracks, holding plates with half-eaten food, moving like phantoms through the Wisconsin heat. Takashi passed the daikon garden. The plants looked strong, the leaves bright green. 2 more weeks and they'd be prepared for harvest. He'd been planning to show Sergeant Miller how to cook them the proper way, had been daydreaming, foolishly, about teaching an American how to make sukimono. Now, he wasn't sure there'd even be a Japan left to remember what daikon was supposed to taste like. If his mother and sister had traveled to Hiroshima to visit his uncle. If the whole world might simply disappear in atomic flames before anyone figured out what mercy actually meant. After Hiroshima, time moved like thick mud. Takashi stopped eating, not as resistance, not as a hunger strike, but because eating seemed obscene when entire cities were being wiped from existence. He went out on work crews because the guards ordered it, pulled weeds because his hands needed activity, but everything felt automatic, disconnected from any real purpose. The corn in the fields kept growing, golden and endless, completely unconcerned with human tragedy. Nakamura wrote letters compulsively, 7, 8, 9 letters daily to his mother in Tokyo, all asking identical questions. Are you living? Are you in safety? Do you have family in Hiroshima? Did you know anyone who lived there? The letters got sent through the Red Cross network and disappeared, and nothing ever came back. He quit the counting habit. The compulsion that had given him some sense of control just stopped, leaving only a vacant waiting that felt somehow darker. What's more, sank into quietness so deep that guards actually noticed. He threw himself into labor harder than everyone else, as if exhaustion could shut down his mind. But as evening came, he'd sit outside the barracks and stare at blank nothing. One afternoon, Takashi found him there in the daikon garden, kneeling in the soil, palms pressed flat against the earth, like he could learn something through the ground. In China, what's more began without lifting his eyes. I watched gardens burn. Watched the men who grew them watch them burn. And I'm here in America, growing vegetables while my country. He stopped, pushed his hands deeper into the dirt. On August 9th, the second bomb landed. Nagasaki. The information spread through camp like infection. Men who had been holding together stopped holding together. The dining hall stood nearly vacant at supper. Inside the barracks, someone wept. Not dramatic crying, but a steady, low keening that continued for hours. Lieutenant Sasaki, that rigid commander who'd refused to join the 4th of July festivities, stood in the barracks that evening and spoke to whoever would listen. This is what transpires when we abandon Bushido, when we embrace comfort from the enemy. Heaven is punishing Japan for our dissolution, for soldiers like you who selected survival instead of sacrifice. His voice fractured on that final word. He was crying too, Takashi realized, not from sorrow, but from watching his entire belief structure crumble completely. The Americans possessed weapons that rendered all warfare meaningless. What meaning did Bushido have against atomic destruction? What value was honor when entire cities could be erased as though they never existed? August 15th came. They were assembled outside in the main yard. Nearly 300 Japanese prisoners from Camp McCoy stood gathered before speakers that had been put up overnight. American guards remained at a distance, present yet unintrusive. Private Tanaka's features were rigid as he detailed what was about to happen. The Emperor will address everyone, he stated in Japanese, speaking on the radio, his actual voice, the divine voice they'd speak of. He'll address you directly. Nobody had ever actually heard the Emperor speak. He was sacred, remote. His words filtered through intermediaries and officials in state propaganda. Hearing his actual voice directly seemed both holy and frightening. Static hissed. Then came a voice, refined, formal, using classical Japanese so old-fashioned that Takashi had to focus hard to understand. The Emperor talked about enduring the unbearable, accepting the unthinkable. He spoke about a new and extraordinarily devastating bomb. He never mentioned the word surrender, but the implication was absolutely plain. Japan had been defeated. The responses came fast and wild. Several men dropped to their knees, others stood motionless. Lieutenant Sasaki let out a sound like he'd received a wound, then walked away toward the barracks. His military discipline finally shattered. One man started screaming, a sound of rage or heartbreak, or both combined. Several wept silently, others simply dropped to the ground as though their bodies no longer obeyed. Takashi felt emptiness. He'd exhausted his feelings across those 10 days. He was a hollow form standing in a Wisconsin field while his nation accepted defeat across waters he would never navigate again. Beside him, Nakamura trembled. What was the purpose? His whisper was barely perceptible. Why did my brother die? All of this? For what reason? What's more rested a hand on the young soldier's shoulder. The veteran's face was damp, yet his voice remained steady. They perished because men who should have conceded in 43 were consumed with pride, because those in power chose honor more than human beings, because we chose attractive deceptions instead of harsh reality. He met Takashi's gaze. We have truth now, at least. At least the dishonesty is finished. What followed was peculiar. Combat had concluded, but they remained confined. They would stay captive until arrangements could be made for them to return home, which might require months. The familiar routines persisted, labor assignments, mealtimes, the unchanging pace of camp existence. Yet everything hung suspended, stranded between former and future. By early September, roughly 3 weeks after, Takashi found himself standing alone in the daikon garden. The radishes had arrived. He noticed the white tips emerging through the dirt, large and magnificent. He bent down and began pulling them free, drawing each one out gradually, clearing away soil. They were extraordinary, superior to anything his mother had cultivated, nourished by Wisconsin earth and American rain, grown from the complete disintegration of all he'd previously believed in. He was collecting the harvested daikon in a basket when shadow appeared in his vision. Sergeant Miller was approaching, helmet held in his hands, regarding the vegetables with obvious appreciation. Private Tanaka offered translation. The sergeant states these are remarkable. In his letters to his wife, he's been describing them. She's curious to sample that pickle preparation. Do you recall the name? Tsukimono, Takashi replied softly. Miller spoke once more, and Tanaka hesitated, translating. He wants to know whether you'd agree to let him purchase one. Since you cultivated them, they're rightfully yours. He's willing to provide payment. Tanaka paused, studying Miller's expression. Actually, money isn't being offered. He simply wants to know whether you'd present him with one, as a present, between another delay. Between individuals who learned what it meant to act human with each other, despite all that occurred. Takashi examined the daikon resting in his grip. It was merely a vegetable. A root withdrawn from soil, yet simultaneously it represented his mother's garden, his sister's voice laughing. A summer celebration in 1941. It demonstrated that growth could happen somewhere foreign, despite wartime. It proved that compassion wasn't deception or tactic, simply the option certain individuals made repeatedly, regardless of whether cruelty presented itself as simpler. He stretched out the biggest daikon toward Sergeant Miller. Please accept this, he spoke in his imperfect English, then repeated himself in Japanese for Tanaka to pass along. Let him understand, let him know it's not something from an adversary. It's something from an individual attempting to reclaim what it means to be human. Miller accepted the daikon with reverence, as though holding something irreplaceable. He responded in English in a way that transformed Tanaka's face. He's expressing gratitude, and he's saying. Tanaka's tone shifted slightly. He's saying his brother perished at Iwo Jima in March, and he's carried that wound inside him like a weight. Yet watching this garden grow, seeing how you've nurtured these plants, it permitted him to reconnect with his sibling loved horticulture too. Before the war started, when they were merely youngsters living in Ohio, Miller removed his billfold and displayed a picture. Two boys, approximately 10 and 12 in age, positioned before a vegetable plot, both beaming at the lens. History captured in monochrome. Takashi produced his own photograph, worn soft and fragile from months pressed against his body, showing his mother and sibling among their plants. Distinct countries, distinct languages, distinct conflicts. Equivalent earth beneath the nails, equivalent fulfillment from cultivation. The pair remained motionless in a Wisconsin camp, showing photographs of gardens that might be destroyed, exchanging a daikon back and forth while each identified elements and Tanaka rendered fragments of meaning. The war had stopped, though its effects continued. Genuine peace hadn't landed yet, but something different arrived, diminutive and vulnerable, yet possibly more significant. The realization that this individual facing you had likewise been human before the conflict shaped them into instruments of destruction. That evening, Takashi composed his initial words homeward since the capitulation. He couldn't determine whether his people endured. He couldn't confirm if Tokyo remained standing, or if his hometown had weathered the devastation. Yet he composed anyway, since you plant seeds regardless of whether you'll reap their benefits. Mother, should this reach you, should you have survived, if a household stays waiting, I must communicate something important. The adversary wasn't as we'd been instructed. I'm not suggesting they were righteous. The weapons they deployed were genuine. The destruction they created was genuine. However, this happened as well. They supplied medication when I fell ill. They compensated my labor. They permitted me to grow daikon, and when the plants flourished, an American requested details regarding it. The manner acquaintances used to approach you about your garden, person to person, being to being. I consumed grilled corn here and experienced emotion because I recollected the festivals. I recollected being your youngster rather than a fighter. Should you have endured, once I make my way home, I intend to transport seeds. Seeds from America, seeds from Japan, does the origin matter any longer? We shall plant them jointly, we shall cultivate growth. Perhaps that represents our healing from what occurred, not through ignorance, but through remembering existence existed before the fighting and can persist afterward. One seed, one dish, one determination to remain human when becoming a weapon would prove simpler. I shall return, Mother, however extended the period becomes. I shall come back, and I shall bring seeds.